The First Peloponnesian War is the strangest of Greek wars. Athens fought it with one hand, and for a decade won. She beat Sparta's allies at sea and on land, fought Sparta herself to a draw, and treated the whole contest as a sideshow. Her real war was elsewhere, against Persia on Cyprus, among the Phoenician cities, and far up the Nile in Egypt, where a great fleet of the Delian League gambled for grain and glory. Then, on an island in the Nile, the gamble failed, a catastrophe so complete that the whole Aegean believed Athenian power broken. This is the story of overreach and retreat, how a Delian League hardened into an Athenian empire, how a rival came home from exile to make peace, and how two exhausted powers, refusing a final battle, settled instead for a fragile peace meant to last 30 years. Two features set this first war apart from the Great War that came later. The first was Megara. From the moment Athens took Megara into alliance in 461 BC, the mountain passes a Peloponnesian army needed were closed, and for most of the war, Sparta could not invade Attica. The second feature is stranger. The Athenians fought the Peloponnesians largely as a sideshow, secondary to operations elsewhere. Through the very years of the war with Sparta, Athens remained continuously at war with Persia, and for at least half that time the Peloponnesian front was the lesser theater. Perhaps not what Pericles wanted. It was what Athens could afford, and the story of that choice begins with the man himself. Pericles emerged in 461 as the undisputed leader of the radical democracy, and he emerged over two fallen colleagues and rivals. Cimon had been ostracized in the political fallout over the aid sent to Sparta. Ephialtes, Pericles' senior colleague, and perhaps the guiding mind behind many of the reforms, was assassinated shortly afterward. The circumstances are obscure, and the usual account blames an enraged conservative. That left Pericles dominant in his early 30s, young by Greek standards for a leading man. He was famous for his commanding oratory. Athenians nicknamed him a kind of Zeus for the thundering voice that could carry over the huge, boisterous crowd assembled on the Pnyx, a body that was very hard to win over. He would hold his position for nearly 30 years. A caution follows. The Pericles Thucydides knew and remembered was the man at the height of his power, the unchallenged voice of Athens. The Pericles of the First War was not yet that man. Athens had other prominent figures, and he was still consolidating his standing. Not everything the assembly voted in the 460s and the 440s reflected his policy. In a Greek city-state, the citizens genuinely decided their own course. A leader could propose a measure, but nothing guaranteed it would pass. Thucydides at times paints an almost idealized picture of Pericles' authority. For these early years, that picture runs ahead of the truth. To see why, follow the other war, the one against Persia, which had never stopped. The victory at the Eurymedon River in 467 or 66 had not ended the conflict with Persia. If anything, it freed Athens and her allies to go on the offensive against the Persian Empire. Each year, fleets of Athenian and allied ships sailed east to Cyprus. They lent support to revolts breaking out inside the empire, among the Phoenician cities, and above all in Egypt, where Persian rule was especially hated. So while Athenian hoplites faced Peloponnesians at home, Athenian oars were beating east, toward the islands, toward Phoenicia, toward the Nile. In 459, a great rebellion rose in Egypt. Its leader was Inarus, a rebel pharaoh drawn from the Libyan military elite that had dominated Egyptian military affairs since the early Iron Age. Since around the 10th century BC, he rose in Lower Egypt in the north. He seized the White Fortress at Memphis and raised the standard of revolt, and the rising spread through the Nile Valley, for few provinces hated their Persian masters more. Here was Egypt, rich in grain, restless under the great king, and now in open revolt. To Athens, the opportunity looked enormous, and the Athenians answered with ships. Against Sparta, meanwhile, Athens held the initiative from the first day, because she held the Megara. The only way the Peloponnesians could contest it was to put a fleet to sea. Their first attempt ended in disaster. That same year, 459, off Kekryphalia in the Saronic Gulf, the Peloponnesian League's own home waters, the Athenian fleet met the Peloponnesian fleet and beat it decisively. Then Athens pressed the advantage. Her troops landed on the island of Aegean, one of the leading naval powers of Greece, and put the city under siege. The Aeginetans held out as long as they could. In the end, they were forced to surrender. The terms show what Athens had become. Aegean was enrolled in the Delian League at a tribute of 30 talents. Its walls were torn down, a democracy was imposed, and its fleet, one of the 4 finest in Greece, was confiscated. To Sparta, this was a grave affront, for Aegean was an ancient Dorian ally. To Athens, it was the removal of an old menace. From Themistocles onward, Athenian statesmen had called the island the eyesore of the Piraeus, the hostile rock in plain sight of Athens' own harbor. Now that rock belonged to the Athenian system, a vital position commanding the Saronic Gulf, and not one Athens would easily relinquish. With Aegean neutralized, Athenian squadrons were free to sail around the Peloponnese and raid its coasts, and in the years that followed, they did. Sparta grew desperate. If the passes at Megara could not be forced, Athens might yet be threatened from another direction, from central Greece, from Boeotia. In 457, the Spartans tried it. With no king available to command, the army marched under regents. It was ferried across the Gulf of Corinth on transports and rafts. The land rose through the Megara being shut, then landed in Boeotia and set about stiffening Theban and Boeotian resistance to Athens. The Athenians marched out to meet them. At Tanagra in central Boeotia, they faced a Peloponnesian force numbered at about 11,500, and fought it to a draw. That result deserves emphasis. Later readers, steeped in Thucydides' account of the Great War, imagine Athenian hoplites shrinking from Spartan spears. At Tanagra, they stood up to the Peloponnesians in the open field. The Peloponnesians withdrew home, and 2 months later the Athenians came back. At Oinophyta, they shattered the Boeotian federal army. Democracies were installed across Boeotia and central Greece, and the whole region was drawn into the Athenian alliance system, governed through friendly regimes. Megara too was reshaped as a democracy, its walls strengthened, and the long walls built to link the city to its port at Nicaea, on the model of the long walls then rising at Athens. By 457, the Peloponnesians were in a hopeless position. They had been beaten at sea. They had lost 2 of their principal naval allies. They had lost every ally in central Greece. One push more. An army landed in the Peloponnese, a junction with Argos, a march on Sparta itself, and the war might have ended there. The push never came. Athens was too heavily engaged against Persia to press her advantages home. The danger passed, not because the blow was parried, but because the arm that might have delivered it was committed far elsewhere. That danger left a mark. In the first book of Thucydides, speeches are recorded at Sparta on the eve of the Great War, and the speech of the Corinthian allies has often been doubted on 2 grounds. It insults the Spartans as slow-witted and unresponsive to crisis, which could be Thucydides editorializing through Corinthian mouths, and the Athenian aggression it paints fits the 450s, not the 430s. Yet that may be exactly the point. The men voting at Sparta in 432 were 30 and older. They had grown up amid the events of the 450s or lived through them. The Corinthians knew their audience. Control of Megara, fleets on every coast, those images had colored a whole generation of Spartans. Dispelling them would have taken much Athenian reassurance, and in 432 the Athenians failed to give it. Athens was winning handily by the middle of the 450s. Then disaster struck, and its cause was a man the Athenians had underestimated. Artaxerxes, son of Xerxes, now sat on the Persian throne. He cared little for the scatter of Ionian towns along the western coast of Asia Minor. He cared greatly about the Phoenician cities, whose fleets were the backbone of Persian sea power. And he cared above all about Egypt. The Athenians had thrown their strength against the province the great king cared most to keep, and against a king with the patience and the means to take it back. The Egyptian revolt received substantial Athenian naval aid, more than 200 triremes sent to operate alongside the rebel army, ships that could push deep up the Nile to Memphis. How many were Athenian rather than allied is not recorded. Either way, the commitment of league strength was major. At first the rebellion prospered, and the prize glittered. Egypt was rich in grain. If it broke from Persia under a friendly dynasty in Memphis, the Athenian grain supply was secured indefinitely. Years later, around 446 or 45, the son of Inarus, attempting a fresh revolt, sent Athens a gift of 30 or 40,000 medimnoi of grain. An adult male citizen needed roughly 6 to 7 medimnoi a year. 30,000 medimnoi at 6 apiece could feed 5,000 men for a year, free of charge. Small wonder Athens threw her main effort into Egypt. Artaxerxes and the Persians proved far more capable than anyone had expected. First, they suppressed the Phoenician revolts and reassembled the Phoenician fleet. Then they invaded Egypt. In 455, Persian forces reappeared in the Nile Valley and caught the Athenians and their Egyptian allies badly off balance. The Athenian fleet was trapped on an island in the river. The Persians drained part of the channel around it with siege works, and the stranded fleet had to be abandoned. Many of the men fled west. Many more perished. It was a first-class catastrophe. How many ships were lost? The full 200, or only part of the force, and how many of them Athenian, remains unclear. What mattered was the perception. By 454, the Aegean believed that Athenian naval power had been broken, and belief acted. Revolts erupted throughout the Athenian Empire, the Delian League, as it was still called. This was a decisive turning point in the character of the League and in the standing of Pericles alike. It was in the late 450s that he demonstrated the mastery which won him the undisputed dominance Thucydides later remembered. The Athenians recognized the truth about their position. They were fatally overextended, and the commitments in the East had to be cut back. The image of Athenian invincibility was gone. What remained was the task of holding the empire together, city by city, oath by oath. A number of surviving inscriptions record the settlements Athens imposed on her rebellious allies in Ionia, in the islands, eventually even on Euboea, notably at Chalcis in 447 or 46. The terms vary from city to city, but the provisions recur. Tribute, and on top of it an indemnity, the cost of suppressing the revolt, a fine for having defied the Athenian people. Democracies imposed where more conservative governments had ruled. Sometimes an Athenian garrison installed in an important city, walls pulled down, ships surrendered. And then the oaths, highly specific oaths, sworn by the whole population of the allied city, to the ancestral gods and to the ancestors, inscribed in stone both in the allied city and at Athens. Their religious language runs close to legal language. The well-preserved Chalcis inscription is the prime example. These were grave undertakings. Alongside these measures came another momentous act. In 454, the treasury of the League was removed from the sacred island of Delos and carried to Athens, to the Acropolis itself. From then on, the phoros, the tribute the allies owed for the common defense against Persia, went directly to Athens. In practice, little changed. Athenian officials had been administering the funds all along, but symbols matter, and the allies' common fund now lay on Athens' own sacred rock, beside Athens' own treasures. Many scholars take this transfer as the symbolic moment when Aedelian League became, in truth, an Athenian empire. Pericles now moved to close the front nearer home. In 451, he arranged the recall of his great rival. Cimon came home with the last of his 10-year ostracism still to run. His value lay in his connections. Cimon was Sparta's proxenos at Athens, its guest friend, and much Greek foreign policy ran through private ties of guest friendship and marriage. He was recalled expressly to negotiate a 5-year armistice with Sparta, not a treaty, not an alliance, simply, in the plain Greek term, a cessation of fighting, and the Spartans were glad to accept. At the same time, the Argives, who had hoped the war would drag Athens into the Peloponnese, made their own 30 years peace with Sparta. So in 451, after 10 years, close to a generation of military-age men, the fighting stopped. One theater was closed. Then Cimon led an allied expedition into the eastern Mediterranean. In 450, an undertaking probably only he could have mounted. His target was Cyprus, and in 449, at Salamis in Cyprus, he won a stunning victory over the Persian fleet. This is not the Salamis of the Persian Wars. That island lies in the Saronian Gulf under Athenian control, though both places claimed descent from the same hero, Ajax the Greater of the Iliad. Cimon himself did not live to enjoy the triumph. He died on the campaign of illness and of wounds from the battle. The victor of the Eurymedon ended his life as he had spent it, on campaign against the great king. Victory led to a treaty. The Peace of Callias, named for Cimon's brother-in-law, concluded in 449. It effectively ended the Persian Wars, the official close of the long conflict between the Greeks and the great king. The terms cut both ways. Athens gave up active support of rebels inside the empire, Egypt included, and withdrew from Cyprus, handing the island back to the Persian king. In return, the king agreed to keep his fleet out of the Aegean, and he allowed Athens to keep the Ionian cities and the former Persian possessions in Europe. That amounted to something remarkable, the great king's own acknowledgement of the integrity of the Athenian Empire. It was a major diplomatic victory. The withdrawal from Cyprus was emotionally painful. The Cypriots spoke an East Greek dialect closely related to that of Athens, and many leading Athenian families had ties of marriage and religion with the princes who ruled there. For many Greeks, Cyprus was a kind of living museum. Its princes seemed not very powerful, yet they rode about in chariots and carried themselves much as the Greeks imagined their own heroes had in the Bronze Age of Homer. Now the island, mostly Greek, with Phoenician communities as well, passed back to the Persian king, and the peace raised a pointed question. If the war with Persia was over, what justified the Delian League at all? Pericles would spend years developing answers, justifications for collecting tribute in what had truly become the Athenian Empire. The term is Thucydides' own. One surviving stone captures what those years cost. Around 459 or 58, the tribe Erectais, one of the 10 Athenian tribes, at once political unit and regiment, set up a casualty list. The stone is imposing, its opening finely cut. Of Erectais, these died in the war, in Cyprus, in Egypt, in Phoenicia, at Haliais on the Saronic Gulf, in Aegean, at Megara, all in the same year. 177 names follow. For a single tribe, this was enormous. If it represents the hoplite levy, 177 dead out of perhaps 1,000 or 1,200 men liable for service. Athens could not sustain such losses overseas, and Pericles knew it. The fighting of the late 450s crystallized his settled policy: consolidate around the empire and the fleet, and avoid far-flung commitments. in Egypt then, and as events would show, in Sicily later. The arrangements in central Greece collapsed quickly. Soon after the armistice, in 447 or 46, two events showed how unpopular Athenian control was, and how little Athens could do to hold the allies, one along their second axis, the one anchored on the Gulf of Corinth. At Megara, the population rose, massacred the Athenian garrison, seized the town, restored an oligarchy, and rejoined the Peloponnesian League. At the same time, the puppet democracies in Boeotia were overthrown. Athens sent about 1,000 men under the general Tomites to shore them up. The force was ambushed and defeated at Coronea. To recover the prisoners, Athens agreed to evacuate all of Boeotia. The inland allies were gone. The Spartans had waited for the 5-year armistice to expire. Now they moved. King Pleistoanax marched the entire Peloponnesian levy into Attica. At the precise moment Athens had lost Megara, lost Boeotia, and faced fresh revolts among her allies, above all on Euboea. Pericles, by now the unchallenged leader at Athens, confronted the invaders at the border of Attica, as most commanders would, to defend the fields and the property of the citizens. The Spartans and their allies were prepared to fight a full hoplite battle and settle the matter there. The two armies stood facing one another, and the battle never came. Instead, Pericles and King Pleistoanax negotiated. Rumors circulated of a bribe, that Pericles had paid the king 20 talents and had entered the sum in his accounts as spent for necessary expenses. Pleistoanax was in fact later exiled on a charge of bribery, and he remained in exile for some 20 years. Whatever the truth of the charge, both sides were willing to come to terms, and what they concluded was the 30 years peace. The name states an ambition, not a certainty. A span of 30 years or 50 was about the most anyone could realistically expect a Greek treaty to hold. This was the treaty still in force in 432, when the final crisis erupted. Thucydides, remarkably, never records its terms. The outline of events is clear enough. The Peloponnesian army withdrew, the Athenians went home and in time crushed their rebels in the Aegean, and the treaty settled the outstanding issues between Athens and Sparta. As peace treaties go, it was workable and sensible. It addressed the major grievances. It provided for arbitration. It dealt with precisely the kinds of disputes that could otherwise drag the two powers into war. Thucydides, however, regarded it as probably no more than another pause between conflicts, and that judgment raises the central question of this whole story, whether the Great War was truly inevitable, and whether the peace born of the First War could ever have held. So the terms must be reconstructed. No full text survives anywhere, not in Thucydides, and not in the later writers Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch. Most of the provisions are recovered from moments elsewhere in Thucydides' history, where the two sides argue over the treaty and appeal to particular clauses. Its physical form followed the conventions of Greek diplomacy. The treaty would have been inscribed on stone, on a stele, a public monument for anyone to read, carrying the names of the men who swore the oaths on behalf of each city, with copies in Athens and in the public spaces of Sparta and her allies. The swearing itself reveals something. All the members of the Peloponnesian League appear to have sworn. Athens swore alone, for itself and for the entire Delian League. One side was an alliance of cities, the other had become a single power. The stele stood on display until 432 or 31, and then, very likely, it was destroyed when war was declared. There is a parallel from a century later. In 338, the Athenians destroyed a stele they had erected to honor a peace with Philip of Macedon. A treaty broken was a monument torn down. That destruction, combined with terms so familiar to contemporaries that they needed no repeating, may partly explain the strangest silence in Thucydides, why the historian of the war never records the text of the peace, whose failure began it. The moment at the border of Attica deserves a second look. The Athenians and Spartans stood where a decisive hoplite battle might have been fought, the kind of clash long taken to define the Greek, and thus the Western, way of war. Such a battle would have seemed a fitting conclusion, settling the question of hegemony once and for all. Either the Peloponnesians prevailed and Athens surrendered, or the Athenians shattered the Peloponnesian army. Yet neither commander chose it. Pleistoanax, the Spartan king in the field, declined the engagement. So did Pericles, then serving as one of the 10 Athenian generals. The most consequential battle of the First War is the one that was never fought. The usual explanation is that neither side was willing to spend its citizens in a great clash, and there is much truth in it. The Spartans had come to respect Athenian fighting quality. Athenian hoplites could match Peloponnesians man for man and formation for formation, as they had shown at Tanagra, and their record ran back to Marathon. They had also fought many battles overseas, often alongside allies in amphibious operations, not only within the Greek world, but in Cyprus, in Egypt, in Phoenicia. That record is easily forgotten because in the later war, Pericles adopted an indirect strategy and refused battle, a course that ran against many of Athens' own military traditions. The Sparta of 446 had no such hindsight. It faced the army of Marathon and the Tanagra at full strength. There may have been a colder reason. Both commanders understood that a single battle could no longer settle the war. The 450s had been a drawn-out struggle, years of ravaging major naval battles, Athenian ascendancy, no clean resolution. This was no replay of the Persian Wars, where Salamis at sea and Plataea on land effectively decided the war. Athens and Sparta had grown far beyond any traditional city-state, with money and men on a scale no single polis had commanded before. The single decisive hoplite collision, the Western way of war Victor Hansen described, no longer applied in the 5th century. Both sides were recruiting mercenaries and allies to spare their own citizens because a war of attrition was ruinously expensive in silver and in lives. The Erechthi's stone had already shown what such a war could cost. And so, probably early in the summer of 445, both sides accepted the 30 years peace. Thucydides treats it as one more milestone on the road to an inevitable war, but said that against the institutions of Sparta and Athens, the legacy of the Persian Wars, and the character of the two alliances. The treaty invites a different conclusion. Had both powers honored its letter and the goodwill behind it, war was not inevitable, and the Great War might never have come. The First War ended not with a shattering battle, but with a bargain. Two powers grown too large for any single clash to decide their quarrel, each sparing its citizens for another day. Whether it was a lasting peace or merely a pause between wars would depend not on its clauses, but on whether Athens and Sparta could summon the goodwill to keep them.